I'm Max Verstappen. I race for Aston Martin Rebel Racing. I am the best driver because I believe that I'm the best.
Let me ask you something honestly. When you think of Max Verstappen, what's the first image that comes to mind? Because for most of us, it's probably the overtakes, the radio messages, that cold mechanical calm he has when everything around him is on fire. Maybe it's Abu Dhabi 2021 and that final lap that broke the internet. Maybe it's 2025 and that comeback that made absolutely no sense by any logical measure of what a racing car is supposed to be capable of. But here's what I want to talk about today. And I promise this is going to hit differently than anything you've watched about Max before. Because behind all of those moments, behind the helmet and the radio and the champagne, there is a life. A genuinely fascinating, complicated, and at times almost unbelievable life that most people have never actually sat down and looked at properly. We're talking about a man who earns $65 million a year, lives in a Monaco penthouse, owns a private jet, runs his own racing team, woke up in the middle of the night this year to run physics experiments on a simulator, and became a father just days before a Grand Prix. But here's the question that actually matters. Here's the thing that should make you curious. How does a kid from a broken home in Belgium, who was left at a petrol station by his own father during a karting trip, who was told he would never be a champion and would probably end up driving trucks for a living, how does that kid become the highest paid racing driver on Earth and one of the most mentally unbreakable athletes any sport has ever produced? Because by the end of this, you won't just know what Max has won, you'll understand exactly why he was always going to win it. And if you already love watching him race, and I know you do, what you feel at the end of this is going to be something a little deeper than admiration. It's going to be that quiet, specific feeling of knowing you are genuinely lucky to be alive at the same time as this person. So let's start where the story looks the most finished and work our way back to where it actually began. Chapter 1. The Life. What $250 million looks like when you actually don't care about money. Max Verstappen has a net worth of somewhere between $200 and $250 million, depending on which source you trust. And the honest answer is that the exact number doesn't really matter, because all of them are genuinely difficult to comprehend for a man who is still only 27 years old. His base salary at Red Bull Racing is $65 million a year, making him the highest paid driver on the current Formula One grid by a significant margin. And that's before the performance bonuses start stacking up, which in 2024 alone added another $21 million on top of that. He is contracted to Red Bull until the end of the 2028 season, which means his base salary alone over that contract period exceeds $275 million. Now, I know what you're probably thinking at this point, and I'm going to stop you there, because yes, he's extraordinarily wealthy, and yes, a lot of elite athletes are extraordinarily wealthy, but the way Max Verstappen actually lives with that money is where things get genuinely interesting. He lives in Monaco in a penthouse apartment in Monte Carlo worth $13 million. And when journalists ask him what he loves about living there, he doesn't talk about the glamour or the social scene or the lifestyle that Monaco is famous for. What he actually says, almost word for word, is that Monaco is where he can be at home without having to worry about the next thing on his schedule. That freedom, he says, is what he values most, not the address, not the postcode, just the ability to sit still for a moment without the world needing something from him. And when you hear that from a man living in one of the most expensive places on Earth, something about it just lands differently than you'd expect. The private jet makes complete sense once you understand that mindset. He owns a Dassault Falcon 900EX worth $16 million, and on a calendar that now stretches to 24 race weekends across 5 continents, the ability to control your own travel, to arrive somewhere rested instead of destroyed, is not a luxury in any meaningful sense of that word. It's genuinely a competitive advantage. Now the garage, and this is where I want you to pay attention, because this detail tells you more about who Max Verstappen is than almost anything else we'll cover today. You would expect a man with this kind of money to fill a garage the way most billionaires do, with things that look beautiful and never move. But what's actually sitting in Max's personal collection is an Aston Martin Valkyrie, a Ferrari SF90, a Honda NSX Type S, a Porsche 911 GT3 RS, and a Renault RS01. Every single one of those cars has a serious racing pedigree, and not one of them is sitting there as a showpiece or a status symbol. Every car in that garage was built to be driven hard, and that one detail tells you more about Max Verstappen's relationship with money than any interview ever could. When this man spends on himself, he spends on speed. It has genuinely never been about anything else. But the part of Max's world that most people completely miss, and I think this is the most underrated thing about him as a person, is what he's been building quietly on the side while everyone was watching the championship battle. While he was chasing a fifth consecutive world title in 2025, Max was simultaneously running his own GT racing team, Verstappen.com Racing. He founded it in 2022, has been developing it methodically ever since, and in 2025 they entered the GT World Challenge Endurance Cup as a standalone team and won the Gold Cup at the Spa 24 Hours. He also hired a former Sauber Formula One performance consultant to run his professional simulator facility in Tilburg, Netherlands, a facility that Formula 2 and Formula 3 drivers now travel to from across Europe, specifically to prepare for their careers. Just think about that combination for a second. He's the highest paid driver on the Formula One grid, he's in the middle of a three-way championship fight, he has a newborn daughter at home, and he's running a racing team that just won at Spa while simultaneously building an academy-level simulator operation for the next generation of drivers. Most people at the absolute peak of their career pull the ladder up behind them. Max is constructing an entirely new ladder for the generation coming after him while he's still climbing his own. And then, in the middle of all of this, in May 2025, just days before the Miami Grand Prix, his daughter Lily was born. He stayed in Monaco to be there, missed the Thursday media day, then flew to Florida and finished fourth in the race. When someone asked him how he managed to switch between being a brand new father and a Formula One driver in the same week, he said something that genuinely stopped me when I first heard it. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is close, that he had worked his whole life to be successful in racing. And while that was incredibly important to him, at the end of the day, it doesn't define real happiness. That real happiness comes from your friends, your family, and the people you love. $250 million, 4 world championships, a private jet and a Monaco penthouse and a garage full of racing cars, a team that just won at Spa. And when you ask him what actually makes him happy, he tells you it's his family, which immediately raises the question of where that perspective came from, because it didn't arrive with the money, and it wasn't born from the success. It came from somewhere much earlier and much harder than any of this. And that's exactly where we're going next. Chapter 2, The Family. The software Joss installed and why Max doesn't need anyone's approval to know he's the best. Most people frame the Jos Verstappen story as a story about tough love, about a brutal father and a resilient son. And yes, on the surface level, that's true. But I think that framing actually undersells what Jos did. And more importantly, it misses what he accidentally created in the process. Because what Jos Verstappen built in Max through years of freezing karting tracks and long drives home and harsh words and zero praise was something genuinely rare in elite sport. He built a man who runs entirely on internal fuel, a man who does not need external validation from anyone on Earth to know his own value. And that specific psychological trait is the foundation of everything Max has ever achieved. So let's look at where it came from. Max was born on the 30th of September 1997 in Hasselt, Belgium, into what is probably the most motorsport-loaded family in the history of the sport. His father, Jos, competed in Formula One from 1994 to 2003. His mother, Sophie Kumpen, was a karting champion who raced in Formula A, Formula K, and Super A, competing against future world champions like Jenson Button, and, by multiple accounts, beating them regularly. This is a woman who won the Andrea Margutti Trophy in 1995 against the best kart racers in the world. So Max didn't just inherit a love of racing. He inherited the actual genetic hardware for it from both sides simultaneously. But here is something important that gets lost in the story. Max was not pushed into a cart, he chose it. At 4 years old, at a track where his father was racing, he spotted a child younger than himself driving a go-kart and told his mother on the spot that he wanted one. Jose said no. Max kept asking. His mother eventually convinced Jose, and 6 months later, Max got his first kart, and after a single day on a rental circuit, Jose bought him a bigger one because the rental was too slow. Now, Jos Verstappen. Your instinct might be to think you already know this story. The petrol station, the frozen fingers, the helmet, and you probably do know the facts. But I want you to look at it from a different angle. Because when you see what Jos was actually trying to transfer to his son, the story changes completely. Jos Verstappen's own Formula One career never reached the heights he believed it should have. He was genuinely fast, fast enough that Benetton signed him to partner Michael Schumacher in 1994. But he never won a race. And then in that same 1994 season, during a pit stop at the German Grand Prix, his car caught fire and engulfed him for over 12 seconds. He escaped with minor injuries, but the psychological weight of that moment, combined with the frustration of a career that never delivered what he felt he deserved, all of that became the fuel for what he did next. He decided his son would not make the same mistakes, and he was going to make absolutely certain of that, regardless of how uncomfortable the process became. He trained Max through freezing winter mornings on karting tracks where the cold was so severe that Max couldn't feel his fingers well enough to hold the wheel. When Max told him he was freezing, Jos told him he didn't care. When the fingers warmed up again, and anyone who's experienced that knows it is genuinely painful, Max complained, and Jos told him to be quiet and keep driving. He would deliberately make changes to Max's kart without telling him, just to force Max to develop better mechanical feedback and communication under pressure. He would tell Max he was never going to make it, that he'd end up driving trucks or buses, not to break him, but because Jos understood something that most parents never do, which is that if your child only performs when they feel safe and praised, they will never survive the moment when neither of those things is available. And here's what Max himself says about all of it, and this is the part that matters. He says it wouldn't have worked for everyone. He's clear about that. Different children, different personalities, but for him, specifically, it was exactly what he needed. Because of how Jos trained him, by the time he arrived in Formula One at 17 years old, nothing the sport threw at him could surprise him. The pressure, the politics, the media, the expectation, none of it landed on someone who hadn't already been prepared for something harder. What Jos built in his son, through methods that were brutal and would by any modern standard be considered completely unacceptable, was a man who does not need anyone in the world to tell him he is good enough. The one person whose approval should have mattered most to him as a child withheld it consistently, and so Max learned, at an age when most of us are still figuring out how to tie our shoes, to generate his own certainty from the inside. Now, the family Max has built for himself. He has been with Kelly Piquet since 2020, and if the name sounds familiar, it should. Kelly is the daughter of Nelson Piquet, the 3-time Formula One world champion, which means that little Lily Verstappen, born in April 2025, arrived into the world carrying championship-winning DNA on both sides of her family tree simultaneously. The racing world has never quite seen genetics stacked like that. Max has also been a stepfather figure to Kelly's daughter Penelope since she was 1 year old, and when Lily was born, he described himself as a bonus dad already, someone who had been doing the job long enough that the arrival of his own biological child felt like a natural extension of something already in motion rather than a completely new beginning. When Kelly and Max announced Lily's birth on social media, the caption read, "Welcome to the world, sweet Lily. Our hearts are fuller than ever. You are our greatest gift." And when someone asked Max whether he hoped Lily would become a racing driver one day, the man who gave up his entire childhood for this sport, who raced through frozen fingers and 17-hour drives home in silence, said simply, "I hope not." That one answer contains the entire arc of his life up to this point. He knows exactly what it cost, and he loves this sport enough that he doesn't want to hand that cost to his daughter. But here's what he did choose to hand on: to himself, and to the sport. The obsession, the thing that runs underneath everything else, the engine that was never switched off. Because even with all of this, the family, the wealth, the championships, the team, Max Verstappen still wakes up in the middle of the night and gets on a simulator. And that is what we need to talk about next. Chapter 3: The Obsession. The man who wakes up at 2 a.m. to drive, even when he's already the best in the world. There is a simulator facility in Tilburg in the Netherlands that most casual Formula One fans have never heard of. It's called the Verstappen.com Racing Pro Simulation. It has 2 professional-grade simulators, one for sports cars, one for single-seaters, and it has become one of the most sought-after preparation facilities in European junior motorsport. Formula 2 championship-winning teams send their drivers there. Formula 3 drivers travel from across the UK to use it. The 2025 Formula 2 championship-winning team used it more frequently than their own factory. Max Verstappen built it, Max Verstappen owns it, and Max Verstappen is personally involved in the physics of it at a level that is, honestly, a little difficult to describe without it sounding like an exaggeration. He hired a former Sauber Formula One driver performance consultant named Atsi Kerkhoff to run the facility full-time. And Kerkhoff, when describing Max's involvement, said something that has stuck with me since I first read it. He said that Max sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night with an idea about the simulator physics, gets out of bed, goes and tests it, and then it actually works. And just so we're completely clear about what we're talking about here, Max is not using the simulator to prepare for Formula One races. He does that at Red Bull's factory in Milton Keynes. This is a separate simulator. This is the one he runs at home in Monaco, because the racing never actually stops in his head, even when everything else does. He once told the team that a specific curb in one of the circuit models was 5 centimeters too high. Not roughly off, not noticeably wrong, 5 centimeters. The developers made the change. At the next race weekend, the simulation matched reality almost perfectly from the very first lap. Now here's where it gets even more interesting, because Max doesn't just use a private simulator at home. He also competes in sim racing professionally, under his own team called Team Redline. And he is, by any objective measure, one of the best sim racers in the world. He has won the Spa 24 Hours on iRacing, the Bathurst 12 Hours, the Nürburgring 24 Hours virtually, and multiple other events across different platforms. And in 2024, Red Bull Racing reportedly told him to cut down on the late-night sessions ahead of race weekends. His response to that, and I love this about him, was completely unapologetic. He said, and I'm quoting him as closely as I can here, "I say, this is my life, and I live my life. I'm not telling you how to live yours, am I?" But here is the thing that the critics who called it reckless completely missed. Max's defense of the sim racing wasn't just about personal freedom, it was about the data. He pointed to Imola, where he did a 24-hour sim race and then won the Formula One race the following day. He pointed to Spa, where it rained in qualifying and he had spent time in the simulator racing Spa in the rain, specifically because of how useful that preparation had proven before. He wasn't just racing for fun in the middle of the night. He was finding edges that don't show up in any dataset Red Bull could generate at the factory. His former teammate Alex Albon once described Max's brain capacity as something that genuinely separates him from other drivers, the ability to track what's happening across an entire circuit simultaneously while fully committed to his own racing line. Sports medicine expert Riccardo Ceccarelli called Max the prototype of the modern Formula One driver, someone who can spend hours in a simulator without any degradation in mental performance, and who will be able to exploit cognitive reserves in ways that other drivers simply cannot access under the same conditions. And when you pull all of that together, the 3 a.m. physics experiments, the 5-centimeter curb adjustment, the sim racing wins the night before Grand Prix victories, the facility in Tilburg that he built not for himself, but for the next generation, you start to see what the obsession actually is. It's not a hobby that got out of control. It's not a quirk or an eccentricity or a personality trait that Red Bull has to manage around. It is the same compulsion that Joss installed in him on a frozen karting track in Belgium when he was 9 years old. The inability to stop. The refusal to accept that the current version of yourself is the best version available. The constant internal pressure to find the 5 centimeters that nobody else is looking for. Joss built the obsession. The obsession built the simulator. The simulator builds the edge. And the edge is what took him to the most pressure-filled, most emotionally charged, most genuinely historic night in modern Formula One history. Abu Dhabi, 2021, the final lap. Chapter 4: The War and the Wait. 2021, the rivalry that became a generational war and the pressure that would have broken anyone else. To understand what 2021 actually was, you have to understand what it was asking of Max Verstappen specifically. He was 24 years old. It was his first genuine championship fight in Formula One, and the man standing between him and that championship was Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion who had won 4 consecutive titles, and who, for the previous 4 years, had been so dominant that the question wasn't whether he would win, but how early in the season it would be confirmed. This wasn't a young driver going up against a rival. This was a young driver going up against the entire weight of an era, against a driver who had been in this position so many times that the pressure of a title fight had become almost routine for him, against a team in Mercedes that had spent years perfecting the art of closing out championships. And Max, with the psychological software Joss had installed, with the obsession that kept him up until 3 a.m., with the absolute internal certainty that he did not need anyone's validation to know his own value, decided to go wheel to wheel with all of it, every single race. The season was violent in the way that only the truly great sporting rivalries ever get. Silverstone, a collision that put Max in the barriers at high speed and had Hamilton taking a 10-second penalty that he absorbed and still won the race. Monza, a crash that left Max's Red Bull sitting on top of Hamilton's Mercedes, with the halo the only thing separating Hamilton from serious injury. Jeddah, a race that felt less like a Grand Prix and more like 2 men trying to resolve something fundamental about the order of the sport through the medium of a racing car. Every overtake felt personal. Every post-race interview felt like the continuation of an argument that had started somewhere earlier in the weekend. The sport was vibrating at a frequency it hadn't reached in years, and everyone watching knew it. Even people who had never watched a Formula One race in their lives were suddenly watching this. And here's the thing about Max that 2021 revealed, something that the years of dominance that followed actually made slightly harder to see. He was feeling every bit of this. Later, reflecting on that season, he admitted that he would never want to relive the nerves of that final race, that the tension would probably give him a heart attack if he had to go through it again. This is a man who was trained to be unbreakable by a father who left him at a petrol station, and even he felt the weight of 2021 pressing down on him. And then came Abu Dhabi, the final race. Both drivers on 369.5 points, level on points at a season finale for only the 2nd time in the entire history of the sport. Winner takes everything. For 57 laps, Lewis Hamilton drove one of the most controlled and dominant races of his career. He was on course for an 8th world championship, a record that would have stood alone in the sport forever. Max was on old tires, managing a gap that wasn't closing, and everything Red Bull tried was not quite enough to bring the deficit down to something manageable. With 10 laps to go, Christian Horner said publicly that they needed a miracle. And then Nicholas Latifi crashed, and the safety car came out, and everything that followed became the most debated sequence of events in modern motorsport history. Max went onto fresh, soft tires. Hamilton stayed out on tires that were 39 laps older. The race director made a decision that the FIA later acknowledged contravened the regulations. And on the final lap, the last lap of an entire season, the last lap of a sporting war that had lasted 8 months, Max dived down the inside of Hamilton into Turn 5 and took the lead. Hamilton pushed back at Turn 9 and Turn 6 and couldn't find a way through.
Max crossed the line and screamed over the radio and burst into tears in the cockpit, and then got out of the car and found his father and held him in a way that told you everything about how long and how hard and how complicated that specific relationship actually was. After the race, in the champion's press conference, Max said something that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is the most revealing thing he has ever said publicly about himself. He said, "The first one will always be the most emotional, because at that point it felt like my career in Formula One was completed. That is the ultimate goal. Everything else that comes now is a bonus." A man who was told by his own father that he would never be a champion, who was trained through pain and cold and silence and zero praise, crossed the line in Abu Dhabi and said, "Done. Goal achieved. Everything from here is extra." That is what internal validation looks like when it's been forged properly. He didn't need the trophy to feel complete. He needed to prove it to himself. And the moment he did, the pressure, 4 years worth of it, a childhood worth of it, just released. Most drivers would have lived in that moment forever, would have made it the centerpiece of their identity for the rest of their career. Max made 3 more championships after it and described each of them as a bonus, because 2021 settled something internal that no external result could ever unsettle. But the sport had one more test waiting for him. The kind of test that doesn't come with a safety car twist or a controversial restart. The kind that just quietly makes the car slower and asks you what you're actually made of when the machinery stops doing the heavy lifting. Chapter 5: The Refusal. 2025, when the car slowed down and the man sped up. After 2022 and 2023, 2 seasons of such complete and total domination that Max won 19 races in a single year, and people genuinely started debating whether the sport had become too predictable. After all of that, 2025 arrived and quietly changed the terms of the conversation. McLaren had built a genuinely exceptional car. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri were fast on every circuit, balanced in every condition, and consistently pulling half a second per lap on the Red Bull across a wide range of tracks. And Max was sitting in a car that, for the first time since 2020, could not simply be driven to the front and left there. After the Dutch Grand Prix, he was 104 points behind the championship leader. 104 points, with a car that didn't have the pace to simply outrace McLaren on merit. By every conventional measure of how a Formula One championship works, it was done. You could be polite about it and call it an unlikely recovery, but everyone in the paddock knew what those numbers actually meant. Everyone except Max. Because what happened from Monza onwards in 2025 was not a story about a car getting better, although the car did improve. It was a story about a driver deciding completely internally and without anyone's permission that the mathematics of the situation were simply not relevant to how he was going to approach the next race weekend. He won in Monza with a chopped rear wing that the updated technical philosophy under new team principal Laurent Mekies had finally unlocked. He ground out a P2 in Singapore in a car that by his own admission probably wasn't the quickest on that circuit. He dominated in Austin in a way that reminded everyone watching what it looked like when Max Verstappen has even the smallest performance advantage to work with. 7 wins from the final 9 rounds of the season, from 104 points down. And when someone asked him about how he maintained his mental strength through a period when the gap looked genuinely insurmountable, Max said something that I think is the most honest thing he has ever said about himself as a competitor. He said, "It's incredibly important. Not everyone handles pressure equally well. It has to be innate. A lot of things can be learned, but some things really have to be ingrained in you, personality-wise, and you can't completely teach those." You can't completely teach those. Think about what he's actually saying there. He is telling you, as directly as he ever has, that what separates him from the rest of the field isn't just speed or racecraft or the simulator sessions at 3 a.m. It's something that was installed in him before he ever sat in a Formula One car.
something that got installed on frozen karting tracks in Belgium by a man who told him he would never make it, and in doing so, made absolutely certain that he would. And then came Abu Dhabi again, the final race of 2025. Max won it. He won it convincingly, leading by nearly 14 seconds at the checkered flag, extracting every single point that race was capable of giving him. And Lando Norris finished third, and that was enough for Norris to win the championship by 2 points. 2 points! He won the race. He lost the title by 2 points. And in the cool-down room, and in the press conference, and in every interview that followed, Max was composed. Disappointed, clearly, in the way that any competitor of that caliber would be, but not broken, not diminished, not in any way suggesting that what had just happened had changed his understanding of his own ability or his own value. Because it hadn't, and it never could. That's the whole point.
The refusal that defined 2025 wasn't the winning. It was the decision, made somewhere around the Dutch Grand Prix, to simply not accept the story that the points table was trying to tell. To keep extracting every last tenth from a car that wasn't good enough, not because the championship was guaranteed, but because the alternative, which was to stop trying, was never actually available to him as an option. Jos installed that too, at a petrol station somewhere in Europe, on a 17-hour drive back from a karting race that didn't go the way it was supposed to. Chapter 6. The Closing. The Grateful Part. At the start of this, I told you that by the end you would understand why Max was always going to win it. And I want to close every loop we opened together. Think about where we started. The Monaco penthouse, the $250 million, the jet and the garage and the racing team he built while simultaneously chasing a fifth world title. It all looked like the destination when we were standing at the beginning of the story. But now you know it's not the destination. It's just what happens when a specific kind of person keeps moving forward for long enough without ever stopping to ask whether they deserve to. The life exists because the obsession exists. The obsession exists because Jos installed it in a 9-year-old boy who couldn't feel his fingers on a karting track in winter and was told to keep driving anyway. That boy grew into a man who wakes up at 2 a.m. to run physics experiments on a simulator because he thought of something and simply cannot wait until morning to test it. That man went into the most pressure-filled season of his career with a car half a second per lap slower than the competition, and refused in the most complete and total sense of that word, to behave as though the result was already decided.
2 points. He came within 2 points of a 5th consecutive championship in machinery that had no business being in that conversation. And he won the final race of the season anyway, because that is simply what he does when you point him at a problem and tell him it can't be solved. There's a version of this story that gets told as a sports story. Driver wins championships, earns money, builds legacy, goes down in history. And all of that is true, every word of it. But the real story, the one that I think hits you differently when you sat with all of it together, is the story of what it actually took. The petrol station in the middle of nowhere, the frozen fingers, the father who never said he was proud until the cameras were rolling, the 3 a.m. simulator sessions that nobody sees, the 104-point gap that everyone said was the end. Max Verstappen is not great because the circumstances of his life were kind to him. He is great because the circumstances of his life were specifically unkind in the ways that built exactly the person Formula One requires to be truly exceptional. And then he took that person and pointed him at the hardest sport in the world and asked him to perform under a global spotlight every other weekend for a decade. And he has never, not once, not in any meaningful way, cracked under that weight. We're watching someone who decided at 4 years old that he was going to be the best, and then simply never stopped moving toward that. Through a broken home and a brutal training regime and a first championship that came down to a single lap, and a 2025 season that came down to 2 points, the direction never changed. The internal certainty never wavered. The simulator never went dark for long. And I think that's what the gratitude is actually about for those of us who've been watching him. It's not just gratitude for the wins or the overtakes or the moments that made us jump off our sofas. It's gratitude for getting to watch someone who is completely, uncomplicatedly, and without any self-doubt whatsoever, themselves. In a sport and a world that constantly applies pressure to make people smaller and safer and more manageable, Max Verstappen has never been smaller, has never been safer, has never once been more manageable than the situation required. We're lucky, not just to have watched him race, but to have watched a person who was shaped by everything that should have limited him and used every single piece of it as fuel instead. That is who he is, and honestly, we're just grateful we got front row seats.